pandemic, there are things that we need to do to help ourselves, and there's also things, those same things that will help our students. So as we get started with this, I just want to first go through the objectives. We're really going to review the impact of COVID. And again, this isn't just on our students, it's on us too. And viewing through a trauma-informed lens, what tools can help us and also help our students. So just try to keep it tied to those kind of three objectives. And wanted you to just take a second and read through this if you have seen this already, but if not, just take a second and go ahead and read through that. And sometimes I think, I wonder if that's how our kids feel, if they just think, I don't know what's going on, but this sure is weird. And it's safe to say it's been a little bit stressful. So I just want to check in with everyone and see how you're doing. If you can just rate on a scale from 1 to 5 how your day has been so far. So 5 being best day ever, couldn't be better, and a 1 is it's terrible, I just really need to go back to bed. And if you'll just type in the chat box what your rating is for today so far. And also, while we're waiting for you to get those ratings typed in the chat box, I also want you to ascribe a feeling word for the reason that you gave that rating. And so think about how you're really feeling. So often we don't really drop in and notice our emotions. We're busy and we just kind of go, go, go. And so I want you to take a moment and really just drop in and notice, how am I feeling? What emotion could I describe my day so far, or why I gave that rating that I did? And if it's more than 1, that's great. I have had people say all of them, and that's fair too. So if you'll just go ahead and ascribe some feeling words to why you gave the rating you did. And then Kristen, if you'll share those out for us, that would be great.
So it looks like so far we're all doing pretty well. We don't have any 2s or 1s.
Wow.
And Brent Heisley says motivated, motivated, but also probably all of them. Haha, from Amber Lee. Brianna says motivated, focus, perplexed, uncertain, indecisive, optimistic, and stuck in a rut. Right.
So even though we're giving good ratings, right? We don't have any 1s or 2s, but notice that those emotions are really on that continuum, and we can feel more than one at a time. We can feel really happy and motivated, and at the same time we can feel a little worried and uncertain. And so I just want to normalize that, recognize that whatever you're feeling is okay, and it's a really good practice to make space for whatever you're feeling. And I often just kind of validate, it makes sense that I'm feeling worried right now because this is kind of something you worry about, or it makes sense that I'm feeling uncertain because this is really kind of an uncertain experience. So just normalize it, make space for it. And in doing that, I want to just start out with a little mindfulness exercise. So I often do this in my trainings, is I give people an opportunity to just kind of focus your attention. So if you're familiar with mindfulness, then this is something that you're used to doing. And Kristen, for some reason, it won't let me advance my slide. It dings at me when I try to advance. Do you know if I did something wrong?
If you click on your presentation, you may need to exit. Oh, okay.
I clicked on it. I needed to do that. My arrows aren't working. All right. So mindfulness has been described by John Kabat-Zinn as paying attention on purpose in the present moment non-judgmentally. And I really appreciate that definition. Mindfulness has been around for thousands of years, and it's really taken hold the last 40 years in our culture as a way to really train our brain and help us. It's helped with anxiety and depression, and it really helps hone our attention. And so because we're so divided, sometimes I say we all have modern life ADHD, meaning we have so many things that take our attention at any given time. You've got a list of emails to catch up on, you've got a to-do list, you've got your responsibilities at home and at work, and we're just busy. And so taking a moment to ourselves where we can really just focus on our breathing. So if you will, just close your eyes or gaze at the floor and just get yourself comfortable and start by taking a slow, deep breath. Just inhale and exhale. And as you do that, just notice how your body feels. Notice any areas of tension, and if you want to adjust or shift in your chair, go ahead and do that. And all we're doing is focusing on our breath. And as you inhale, imagine you're filling up your lungs like a balloon. And so maybe your posture rises and opens up. And as you exhale, maybe even your posture tilts in just a little bit. So really get those deep cleansing breaths. And whenever your attention wanders, whenever a thought comes into your mind, just notice it and then gently bring your awareness back to your breath. We all have a lot to do, but right now, right here, there's nowhere else to be. There's nothing else for you to do except for be in this moment and focus on your breath. And remember, be gentle with yourself. If those thoughts just keep coming, just know that's what our brain does. And it's just doing its job. And just notice, and then without judging, just gently bring that awareness back to your breath. Nothing comes next. And then let's finish with just one breath for all of us. Just breathe in and breathe out. And then just go ahead and bring your attention back to the room. And as you do that, I want you to just recognize, what was that like for you? Did you notice that it was difficult? Did you have a difficult time just kind of letting go of maybe those thoughts and wanting to follow them, or just feeling like, oh my goodness, so many things are coming at the same time? Or did you find that it was easy? And if you would, type in the chat box just what that was like for you. Was it pretty easy, or did you notice it was a little bit challenging? Just kind of what did you notice about your own ability to just hone your attention in on your breath? Anybody willing to share?
In the chat box we have from Katie, I feel that in my soul, my mind wouldn't shut up. Challenging, difficult at first, but felt good to recenter.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you being willing to share that. Don't judge yourself. Just find that self-compassion, be willing to be kind to yourself, and recognize that it's okay wherever you are. Just be okay with that. Mindfulness is one of those strategies that we'll talk about later in the presentation, but I always like to start out with it because I want you to try it and experience it. And I know you all have a lot going on, and I want you to really just be able to be present here with us in this time that we have together. And it reminds me of Mr. Rogers, if you've seen his documentary, and he talks about the most important thing is who is right in front of me right now. And I really appreciated that, because I think, gosh, whoever he was talking to must have always felt like they were the most important person in the world, because he gave them his full attention. And I really strive to do that and try to do that, because one of my intentions is always being present, because it's difficult, right? We have so many things pulling our attention and so many things on our plates and thoughts that come and go. So I want to be present for you today. And I want to encourage you to harness this practice. And if it is difficult, just know that just 1 minute a day will make it easier for you. And I know we all have at least 1 minute where we can rest our eyes and just focus on our breath. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. And you might wonder why we have a picture of potatoes. Well, this is just an analogy for think about stress as a level, right? So if you've ever filled a pot with water to boil potatoes, you just kind of eyeball that water level, right? You just kind of think, okay, this is about how much water I need, and then you boil that water, and then you put in the potatoes. And sometimes your pot, once those potatoes get in and stop boiling, sometimes your pot boils over. Maybe that's happened to you. That happens to me sometimes. And I think, wow, I really misjudged that water level. I didn't realize, I guess, that there was so much. And I relate this to our stress level. So I think of that water level as our baseline level of stress that we all have. We just have a normal baseline level of stress. And then things happen that will, raise it temporarily, and then it comes back down. And so, for example, just getting up in the morning and, hearing that alarm will just raise our stress level just a little bit, but just enough to get us up and on our way. And one thing that I think about when my stress level goes up a little bit more is if I'm in a situation like when I am in the ocean and I'm swimming, I'm really worried that sharks are nearby. And so my stress level goes up quite a bit for that time. And then when I get out of the water, it comes back down. Or if I'm hiking in the Tetons and it's bear country, same thing. Stress goes up and just until I'm out of the woods, right? And then it comes back down. And so that's pretty normal. And we do that when we're faced with something that we perceive as a threat. But what's happening right now in pandemic is that this threat is ongoing. It doesn't let up. And there's not really an end in sight. And so what's happening is our stress level is going up and it's just kind of staying up. And we might not realize it. We might not realize that we're a little more stressed, which can make us a little bit more irritable, a little bit more on edge. And so, as you think about that pot of boiling water, just recognize that sometimes, like we misjudge that water level, and then our pot boils over. That if we're misjudging our stress level, that it's going to take less for our pot to boil over. And so we can only handle so many potatoes. If you think of those potatoes as stressors, we can only handle so many, right, before our pot just boils over. And so the reason I want to talk about this is we're seeing people act in ways and say things and do things that are probably out of the ordinary. And that I think there's a real representation of their stress level. And if we're unaware of it, then we're not as ready to, I guess, kind of manage those potatoes as they come. So if you're acting out of the ordinary, or you're thinking like, wow, everyone's pressing my buttons today, or gosh, it didn't sure take me much to get over the edge today, just recognize it's just that cumulative stress. And we're all in this. And so we just have to be a little bit more patient with each other, a little bit more patient with ourselves as we go through this. And so maybe we do need to minimize the amount of potatoes that we're willing to take on, or how much we can do on any given day. And just relating this to our nervous system, because we know that stress is all a part of our nervous system. And so that fight, flight, or freeze is activated whenever we are faced with that threat. And so if you perceive any threat to your safety at all, your fight or flight will kick in. And that's typically when our thinking brain goes offline, and then we're not able to make the best decisions. And that's when we see people at their worst. But our number one priority is survival. And so that's why we see that. And this will just be helpful to remember throughout our time today. The impact of COVID has been different for everybody. Some people have been really sick. Some people have even lost loved ones to this. People have experienced job loss, which means economic hardships and food insecurity. We've seen a real increase in family stress. That loss of structure and routine early on in quarantine was really difficult. We were socially isolated. And so we know in our homes that people have experienced increases in domestic violence and abuse and neglect, and also an increase in reports of mental health difficulties. Just for an example, our National Crisis Hotline has experienced an 891% increase in crisis calls since March, which is unheard of. And so recognize that a lot of people are struggling, and it's different for all of us because maybe it hasn't impacted you in these ways, but we have to keep that wide lens of how is it impacting the people around us. And I highlighted these three areas that I think in school we have a lot to do. We have a lot of influence, right? That we give our employees, we give our students structure and routine. And there's so much safety in that predictability. When they come every day and see the same people and they do the same thing, it really creates that safety net for them. And then they're not socially isolated. They get contact with their peers and with their teachers. And also, we can recognize the students who may be struggling, or even our peers and coworkers, and we can get them connected to some resources if they need that mental health support. And along with that, recognize that there are some determining variables that will influence how this does impact people. For example, perception. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, because how we perceive anything will really dictate our experience. The exposure, the level of exposure to this pandemic, the intensity of it, how severe has the quarantine been, or, the increase in stress, even that stress level pre-pandemic. Some of us just tend to run a little bit higher. And so if we had a little bit higher of a stress level, then, we're that much closer to, the top of that pot. Our own histories of trauma influence this, and the type of protective factors that are in place, resilience characteristics, and also racial inequity. And the two areas where I think schools really have influence, again, are those protective factors and those resilience characteristics. So we're going to focus a lot on that today. As you have all had a lot of, I think, a lot of professional development on what it means to be trauma informed, and how these stable, caring adults are the key to resilience. There's lots of things that build resilience, but one of the keys is that stable, caring adult. And I want to share an experience to kind of illustrate this. So, for example, I started thinking about, in my life, when have I ever experienced something similar to this pandemic? Because I've never lived through a pandemic before. I don't know if you have, but I never have experienced this. And so I was thinking back, and I remember in 1988, I was 11, and we were experiencing one of the worst droughts in US history. They said it was the worst since the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, and it was expensive to the United States, and there were lives lost that year because of excessive heat. It's not too different from actually what's happening right now, unfortunately. But just to give you an idea, what was happening around where I lived was Yellowstone caught on fire, very similar to California right now, and it was scary to this 11-year-old, thinking, oh my goodness, we're having a drought, we don't have water, Yellowstone's on fire, what if it spreads here? And this is where I lived. I lived right up here in northern Utah. I kind of circled where that is, and we were in a huge drought. Our house where we lived was on well water, so I kind of attached this picture here to illustrate. We weren't attached to city water. We were on a well, and my dad had acreage for horses, and he grew hay for our horses. So because we didn't have any water or rain, our canals were empty. We couldn't irrigate the fields. And I was really concerned, again, through my 11-year-old lens of, we're going to run out of water. What if our well runs dry? We won't have water to drink or to bathe, or, already our crops have dried up. And so it was really alarming. It was really scary. And I was really concerned. And so what I did is I looked to the adults in my life. Now, keep in mind, this was during the summer, so I wasn't in school. I didn't have access to really any other adults except for my own family. And when I looked to my parents, they were watching the news. And, my dad's a worrier. And so everything in our house was, this is really bad. This is a drought. I remember my dad saying, we're going to burn up and die, and in his adult version, I'm sure in his mind, he's just being a little bit, facetious. But as an 11-year-old, I really took that to heart, and I was really worried, looking at the fires in the across the country and how bad this was. And so what I realized is that my dad was modeling this thinking error called catastrophize. And when we catastrophize, it just means we look to the very worst possible outcome. And the problem with that is it heightens our anxiety and our depression. And so this can be problematic. We've got to really change the way that we're thinking. And the reason I want to share this is because our perception is our reality, right? We perceive the world through our senses. And so that means when we experience something, we remember it. it stays with us. And our perception is how we interpret it. And then that shapes our perspective, which is how we see it. It's our point of view. And of course, then that is our reality. And so just to kind of illustrate this, for example, the first time I grew a garden, I thought, oh, all I have to do is have a pile of dirt and I'll plant my seeds and, I'll water it, will get sun, and then I'll have these wonderful carrots. And then I was really surprised when I went to dig up my carrots and they all looked like this. And I thought, oh, well, I guess there's a lot more to it than just water and sun and seeds, right? And what happened is I had really rocky dirt and it wasn't soil and it didn't have any nutrients. And so these carrots just tried to grow around all those rocks, and without that proper nourishment, they just didn't fare so well. And that was kind of my first lesson in the reality of, wow, the way I perceived that, what I thought was real, actually wasn't real. And so when I think of this, it always reminds me to remember how important our experiences are, how important our environment is. And so as I look at our kiddos, what messages are they getting at home? What's the talk in their home about this pandemic? Is it catastrophizing? Because I've had a little first grader this year already say, I'm really scared because I don't want it to be the end of the world. And so what's the talk in that home, and what are the messages that they're getting? And when they were on quarantine, again, like in the summer of 1988, the kids weren't in school. I wasn't in school. I didn't have any other adults talking about this or, giving me another perspective or another view of how to look at this. So I want to just briefly explain kind of this ABC model of resilience that some of you might be familiar with. But basically, just what it means is that we experience something. So we have an experience, and then our interpretation of it, right, our perception, will then result in the impact, like how do I feel and what do I do? And we really have a lot of influence over the B and the C, over interpreting this situation, because kids are going to look to us. Kids look to the adults in their lives to help model, how should we respond to this? What should be we worried about? Or is everything going to be okay? And then that will impact, right, how we feel about it. So let's pause for just a minute. And what are some things that you guys have been hearing from your kiddos? What are some things that they've shared, or even some things that you've been concerned about as we've been experiencing this together? And our interpretation might be different based on our experience. Just let's share out some of those things, some things that you feel like the kids are worried about. Go ahead and type those in the chat box and I'll have Kristen share those out.
Just one thing that Katie had mentioned before is sleep disruptions and irregular sleep patterns are a big issue as well.
Yeah, definitely, right? And if we are experiencing sleep disruptions, we know that we're stressed. Sleep is always our first indicator that we're worried or stressed. Something's going on. And we're going to talk more about that too today. What else?
So Colleen says, on top of everything else happening with COVID, some of our refugee immigrant youth are being evicted from their homes. A few of them have expressed that their families do not know where to go or what to do. And then from Katie, my nephew's ADHD symptoms have become much worse, and he is struggling to learn and retain information. Holly says fear, anxiety over losing friends because they don't get to see them as often.
Yeah, those are all very important areas for us to look at and pay attention to, because that is the experience. We're seeing the same thing. And two, just having our kids out of school for so long and being out of their routine, especially our kiddos with ADHD. or other types of neurological disorders, they really struggle when they get out of that routine and then they have to come back into that routine. We're seeing people being evicted, and so their priority is survival. Where are we going to live? Where are we going to sleep tonight? So our homeless liaison is really busy, trying to help with that. So these are all things that are happening, and even if it's not right within our sphere, um, you know in a school, when you have 800 kids, that's a lot of experience that's going on there. And if our kiddos think about the definition of trauma, what makes an event traumatic? So trauma is an experience. And so if it involves a threat, real or perceived, to your physical or emotional well-being, if it's overwhelming, if it exceeds your capacity to cope, it results in intense feelings of fear and lack of control, if it leaves you feeling helpless, then that will be traumatic. And that will change the way you see and understand the world, yourselves and others. There's a term called trauma schemas, which just basically means I see, this is my perception now. Because of my experience now, I see it this way. And so hopefully that will help you kind of put that into perspective as you think about, are our kids experiencing this as traumatic? Because some of them are, right? If that fits the criteria for what they're going through right now, then they are experiencing that trauma. Kristen, did we have any others give input on that one?
I think that was it for that.
Okay. And one thing, just a key that I always want to remind us of is, if you have seen or not seen the Resilience documentary that came out in 2016, it highlighted that adverse childhood experiences study in 1998. And what they found was that there were really 10 adverse childhood experiences that really equated or correlated with higher risk later in life, both physically and mentally. And so this is really a landmark study that we use a lot to inform, to help us be trauma informed and inform what we do and how we intervene with our kiddos. So I just wanted to show you, in case you weren't familiar with those kind of top 10 adverse childhood experiences. And what they found is that they were pretty common. Um, this is not a very clear slide, but almost a third grew up in a house with substance abuse. 23% were their parents had been divorced or separated. 17% had a parent that had mental illness. 13% had domestic violence in the home. 11% had psychological abuse, a third had physical abuse, 21% sexual abuse, and then the neglect, the emotional and physical neglect equated to a quarter, 25%. And so what we found when they did this study is that their risk went up, right, for their level of depression, for even heart disease. And we did this in our own district where we looked at what are our ACE scores. And so as you can see, we compared our administrative ACE scores with the original ACE study. And if you look at 4 or more, this is when the risk really went up for people, is when they had experienced 4 of those adversities. And we are much higher than the original study, which is really important because these are the leaders in our district. And so what that told me is, wow, they know a lot about resilience, don't they? Because if 20% have experienced at least 4. And so we would describe that as complex trauma. If you've experienced more than one trauma, we describe that as complex trauma. And a lot of our kiddos have experienced that. This is just one graph that kind of shows how the rates of depression correlated with the ACE score. So you can see the red is the women, the yellow is the men, but with the increase in each ACE, that level of depression went up. So we know that people with high ACE scores are more likely to struggle with that. And students with high ACE scores, they struggle in school. They're more likely to have learning and behavior problems. They're more likely to fail a grade and not do as well on tests. And they get suspended and expelled more often. And so this is important for us going into it. So I just wanted to include it as we really try to keep that trauma-informed lens that recognize this is some of our kids already pre-pandemic. And then we add a pandemic on top of that. And so just to be aware of what we need to be prepared for. And that these, if we experience it as trauma, we will have long lasting impact from this. So, just as an example, going back to the drought of 1988, it's been almost 30 years since that experience. And when I see like a broken sprinkler like this, I feel physical distress. When I see people leave the water running, or to brush their teeth or rinse dishes, I really have a physical reaction to that. But that's because I really experienced that as trauma. My experience met that criteria, and so what that means is it stays with us. And so this would be an example of a trigger. And so recognize when our kids come to school and they act out of the ordinary, we have to be thinking about, man, what's the trigger? What's that I have no idea, or I couldn't even know, what might be the trigger for them, but I'm seeing it manifest here today. And so remember that behavior is communication, and we've really got to look at our kids as, what, they're just doing the best that they can, um, with the skills that they have. So what are they trying to tell me through their actions? What's the unmet need here? And so it's really getting curious about what they're doing. And I want to show you a picture of a student that we have been working with. This was preferable for him rather than going to class. And so some of you might be familiar and have students very similar to this, that they really just struggle to even stay in the classroom. The minute that we started any type of classwork, he would run. And this is where he wanted to be. And so we can, we can take this personal and think, oh man, this student hates me. What, I, because he, was very verbal and had a lot of things to say, and doing everything we can to help him. Despite all of that, he just really struggled. And so we have to get curious and think about, gosh, what's been his experience? What's been his experience that this is appropriate, to scream and yell at me like that and then run out of class? I wonder what's going on with him. I wonder what triggered this. And so we really start digging into and thinking about, okay, this is not, that's not typical behavior. And so when our students are acting that way, try really hard not to take it personal. Don't personalize it. Recognize they're just doing the best that they can with the skill set they have. And this is about their skill set. It speaks to what's going on with them. And I know that that will always help us to be a little bit more compassionate. So not be an emotion judge. As Mark Brackett would say, he's over the Center for Social Emotional Learning at Yale, and he teaches us to be an emotion scientist. So be curious about how our kids have been impacted. Be curious of what their experience has been, what has been traumatic for them. Are they experiencing grief at the same time? Because unfortunately, some of our families have lost loved ones during this pandemic, and that is only going to magnify, the situation. So just want to remind us, let's be an emotion scientist and just be curious and recognize that fight or flight. Because when our kiddos are triggered, they might very quickly go to fight or flight. And when they're there, their thinking brain is completely shut down. Their nervous system is activated. And the only thing we can do in that moment is help bring that nervous system arousal down. We've really got to engage the parasympathetic nervous system, which brings down the activation so we can, slow our heart rate, calm our breathing. So our priority is helping them feel safe in that moment. Do we have any questions at this point before we move on? Anyone have a situation or a question? You might see some students with some erratic behavior that confuses you and you think,
Tammy, if I could, I've had a youth before who acted out, and until we learned what kind of background and trauma that youth had gone through, we didn't understand, and we tried to go around it. This is the rule, you have to follow the rule. But until they feel safe and until they feel um, understood, I feel like uh, they weren't able to have that control in their life because they were in that fight or flight situation.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Uh, we see that all of the time, don't we? And until they feel safe, you said it, we really won't get anywhere. It was like the picture of our student. He did not feel safe at school, and no matter how nice and kind we are and how safe we feel like school is, these kiddos that have experienced that complex trauma like he had, they have to feel safe, and we have to figure out what will help them feel safe first, because of course they're not going to be ready to follow instructions or learn from us if they're in fight or flight or even freeze. So that's a really good example of that. All right. So just to remind us that when we do see this behavior, recognize that our kids, they don't feel good inside. I never see kids hurt other people when they're feeling good. It just doesn't happen. And so we know that these are signs that they're struggling, that they're feeling some pain. And so we've got to help get them that support that they need again to feel safe. So this is one of my favorite things. Is to help our kiddos to help normalize this experience. So remember that kiddos who have experienced trauma, their brain is wired differently, right? It's shaped their brain. It's that experience is saved in their brain, and so they don't necessarily see the world as a safe place. So they're always scanning and they're always determining what's a threat or what's safe, and so they're looking to us to determine if we're safe or if we're a threat. And so that's why it's important for us to keep our facial expressions neutral, to always talk in a calm voice. We can be firm, but calm. So we wouldn't raise our voice. That's an ineffective strategy. We want to be able to model regulation. And so I find that when we can help normalize this experience, that can be really helpful. And so recognizing, we're in pandemic, and when we're in pandemic, we wear masks and we up our sanitation and we, physical distance. And this is just kind of what we do. And I like to make the distinction between physical distance and social distance, because it's important that we not socially disconnect in any way right now. We need that more than ever. And so we keep our physical space, but we're still going to socially connect. And so when you have kiddos show up, and if they're vulnerable enough or willing to share how they're feeling, like if they say, I'm scared or I'm sad or I'm worried or whatever, then rather than saying, don't worry, don't be scared, don't be sad, because don't we often just think, we just want them to feel better. Oh, don't worry, it'll be okay. And let's talk through this for just a minute, because it doesn't exactly validate how they're feeling in that moment. And so when a student is expressing that, then it's helpful for us if we can say, well, of course you're feeling scared because this is scary and it's unknown. And when we don't know the outcome, that can make us feel nervous. What helps you when you feel nervous? What do you need? Or how can I help you? What can I do? And so we're just taking what maybe we might be more conditioned to say, and we're just reframing it, right? We're just transitioning that a little bit. And this concept of normalizing, but with the empathy piece, right? Like, I get it. Oh, yeah, that is scary, is really important, because the more that we think that this is a crisis, or, this is never happens before, we're going to stay in that fight or flight. And so by normalizing it, it helps us bring that nervous system down, because we're able to say, oh, okay, so this is just what we do. We're just going to normalize that, recognize this isn't pathology, it's just humanity. And we struggle, we overcome. This is really what life is about, is challenges. We can't guarantee the outcome. And so I have a lot of people ask, well, I always want to reassure kids, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. And we have to look at that and examine, are we guaranteeing the outcome when we say that? Because I don't know. I don't know what their family health situations are. I don't know who's high risk, or I don't, there's so many things that I don't know. And so I always want to focus my talk with the students on what they can do, that we'll figure this out. I've seen you overcome difficult challenges before, so I know you can do it. But rather than just give them a blanket reassurance, it's going to be okay, because I don't know that for sure. So if you have some questions about that, please start typing in as we kind of talk about about this, because just normalizing and empathizing can help them feel safe. Recognize that we're a buffer for kids, right? As they look to us, that if we are modeling catastrophizing, and that if we're really showing that, then that will, it's like that trickle down effect, right? That will affect the kiddos. And if we're looking at really helping build the resilience, then we're that stable, caring adult that really is interested in how they're feeling and how they're doing, how their family is. If we know someone in their family is sick, we can ask them about it. How's so and so doing? How are you doing? And just so that they know that you're there for them. And so we have a huge opportunity here to influence by either normalizing or catastrophizing this situation. Kristen, any comments or questions?
Yes, so we have one from Holly. She says, do you have any tips, suggestions on how to help the youth going through a shutdown while keeping the rest of the group on track? Other youth might laugh, etc., which doesn't help the situation.
Right. So would that mean that maybe a certain group of a school is quarantined, but nobody else is? Is that kind of what we're looking at?
I think so, or even in non-quarantine times, doing an activity with a group of kids, and one you might not have expected to trigger something in one youth that then sort of starts, to show its effects. How do you manage that situation when you sometimes can have other kids in the group that are gonna, not intentionally, but egg on the student who already feels like they've been raised to, like, their anxiety level has already been raised in this situation?
Mhm. So I think your focus has got to be on helping that student feel safe, but also at the same time mitigating this the circumstance over here with the kids who might be egging them on. So I think empathy is always a great way to do that. How do you feel when you're scared? What does that feel like for you? Or when you've been worried about something, how does that feel? And what was helpful for you? And so I think the more that we model that for the kids, because they're going to look to us, and so I always want to make sure, even though I'm mess up all the time, that's my first priority, is how whatever I do here, they're going to look at, they're watching, and they're going to think that's okay, whatever that is. So I always just try to model that empathy first, so help that student feel safe, and then help channel that by helping those kids say, if that were you, how would you feel? What's it like for you when you're in a situation that's difficult and people are staring, or you know I always want to talk and teach and model for the kids.
And Tammy, we also have a comment in the chat box that says, from Katie, I think we can say that we are doing everything that we can to help them stay safe.
I think I agree. And this is my view. I really think schools are such a safe place, and I've been walking through our schools since school has started. We opened on day one, and kids are wearing their masks and they're sanitizing, and it almost feels, I mean, our behavior is down so much. And I just think kids are so grateful to be back in school and have this routine and see their friends and have access, to other people. And so it might be a little bit of a honeymoon period. But, we are just doing everything we can. And that's what's perplexing, is when kids struggle, we look at and we think, gosh, it could be safer, it could be safer. And that's why having that trauma informed lens is so helpful for us to recognize when kids do go off like that, that there's an unknown trigger. There's no way we could know all their triggers. There's just no way, right? No one could have ever known that watching the water run, was a trigger for me. And I would need to leave. I would need to take a break from that. I wouldn't be able to stay and watch water run, and no one could have known that could have been a trigger for me. So just always being that scientist, and remembering that every positive attuned interaction that the students have with us is going to rewire their brain. So regardless of what their learning is right now and what their neural pathways that are formed, support those habits and that behavior, that this is what gives us hope, right? Is that we have plasticity, that we can rewire our brains, but we only do that through experience. So these kids have to experience something different. we're not going to earn their trust right away. If they have complex trauma, it's going to take them a long time to feel safe with us, and they're going to be hyper vigilant. They're going to be watching us to determine if we're safe. And so that takes a lot of time. But when we do that, then eventually you'll be that safe person and they will feel safe with you, and then you will be able to help them, rewire their brain as they experience something different. So with that, if is there any other questions or comments with that section before we kind of move into the tools? Okay, well, if anything comes up, to speak up, but we want to talk about the most important thing that we can all do, and again, model for our kids, is this concept of self-care that is not selfish. And you've probably heard a lot about it because we talk about it all the time, especially in education. But this is the most unselfish thing that we do, because we just can't be there for other people if our own needs aren't met. So it can involve a lot of different things, from taking care of ourselves, but having good boundaries, asking for help when we need it, and certainly practicing self-compassion. So I did put some resources in the resource folder, some handouts and some printables, things that I think you can use for yourself, but also with your kids. And one of them is take time for your selfie. And so that's an acronym that you're probably familiar with, just making sure that you're getting enough sleep, that you're eating nutritiously, that you're getting outside. We all need some sunlight every day, that you're having fun, you're still interacting, you have social connections, and that you're exercising, even if it's just a short walk every day. So I set up a handout for you that will allow you to go through in a SMART goal fashion and set goals in any of these areas, if you would like to focus on that or support. It's an activity you could do with your kids to help them set goals, and they can take it home and do it with their families, because again, that sleep is that first thing that will probably be interrupted when we're experiencing some stress and anxiety and we're struggling a little bit. And so it will have some pointers for sleep hygiene, which is just a routine. It's just, we teach our brain that what comes next is sleep, because we do the same thing over and over. Kind of like your morning routine. We have kind of that sleep hygiene. Maybe we turn the lights low, or we play soothing music, or maybe we journal or read, but it's just those activities that prepare us to get ready for bed. So I would encourage you to look in the resource folder and to do that, and also practice some mindfulness. So I also gave a handout for doing just a 1-minute mindful breathing exercise. And again, if you only dedicate 1 minute a day to it, that's still 7 minutes in a week. That is more than you would have had if you didn't do it. And the more that you practice it, the easier it gets. And then the more you can model that for your kids. And this is something that we're trying to really just build into our every single day at our school. Probably our kids are doing this in multiple classes as they go throughout the day. So you can always kind of start out your activity with one of these activities. Another one is just, again, how are we thinking about it? Sometimes we just have to change the way we're looking at a situation. And so this can be really helpful if you see kiddos that are really struggling with those negative thoughts. They say negative comments, maybe even self-deprecating. We can help them change that language, change that self-talk. Just because it's difficult now doesn't mean it will always be difficult. These thoughts aren't necessarily facts. And sometimes it's really helpful when a kid is really anxious and really worried, is to just ask, what's the worst that could happen? And then be able to talk about that. If that were to happen, then we would do this. What would our plan be? Who could we talk to? And then it gives you a little bit more information about if you need to get them connected to more support. And keep our thoughts optimistic, because really there's only 2 ways we can look at the world, right? Optimism or pessimism. And optimism will breed hope, and pessimism will breed despair. And so that will really shape our experience, just depending on how we're looking at it. And so that one can't be understated enough. Thought diffusion is another strategy that can be really helpful, which just is kind of like mindfulness, but it's a little bit different, because instead of not engaging with our thoughts, we just notice and we just notice and bring our attention back to our breath. When we're doing thought diffusion exercises, we kind of do the same thing. We close our eyes, but we do this visual imagery where we imagine something like, for example, leaves falling into a stream, and the leaves go down the stream. And when that thought enters our mind, we just picture putting it on that leaf and watching it float away. And so it's more of an active exercise. And diffusion just means that instead of fusing with it, we're defusing. So we're recognizing we're not our thoughts. We're separate from our thoughts. That was just a thought. I don't have to follow it, and I can disconnect from it. And so that can be kind of a helpful one for you if you're struggling. Even with a student, if you tend to they trigger your fight or flight right away because of your learned experience with them, that sometimes recognizing, okay, I'm having this thought, and then just be able to let it go. With validate and empathize, this is probably all we'll have time for, where we'll end today, is this concept of how we can validate when a student is struggling. So I find often that when a student's crying, the first thing we want to do is run to them and say, oh my goodness, what happened? Are you okay? And one thing that is really helpful is just changing that up a little bit. Instead of that approach, just start by labeling how you think they feel. And this has been so successful as I've used this with kids. When I see them crying, I just say, you look sad. And they always tell me how come. You know, I had a girl come in school this morning, and I said, she came in crying, and I said, you look sad. And her brother was with her, and he said she forgot her mask, and she was just in tears. You know, she forgot her mask, and she was so upset about it. And so they always tend to tell you. And so I have an example here. So if a child comes into the school crying, this is just a real example that I had happen the other day. And so I said to the child, I said, you look sad. And she said, I miss my mom. And so I just restated, you miss your mom? She said, yes, she had to leave me here and go to work. And so I just validated that. I said, it is hard to leave our mom to go to school. She misses you too. What grade are you in? And she said second. And so then I was able to share a little bit of personal experience, which might not fit for everyone, but always try to find that common ground if you can, because even if we don't understand the situation, can we relate to it? So in this example, I was able to say, oh, my son's in second grade, and we miss each other at school and work. What helps me is I remember that he is doing his work and I'm doing my work, and then we see each other after school. So when you see your mom after school today, what do you want to do with her? And she'll say, you know, I want to play with her. And I'll say, I'll bet she'll be excited to see you and play with you too. Let's go to class. And so in doing that, you know, we can take these kind of, you know, experiences where we think, oh my goodness, you know, how long might this take? Sometimes it takes up to a half hour, an hour to get children calmed down. You know, this little gal, she was from the sidewalk in her class in 2 minutes, just by having this conversation where I just started out by labeling and then validating. And so as you think about, I almost want to call it Veen, you know, validate, empathize, normalize, empathize. So as we've gone through how to normalize, validate, and always just end with empathy, I think that those are some of the biggest things that we can do to help our kids earn our trust, feel safe with us, and help them manage some of these difficult emotions that if we're not seeing them now because we're in honeymoon, are certainly probably going to be showing up pretty soon. Any final questions or comments about that? No? Okay. Well, let me flip to, if I can. Oh, go ahead.
There's a few comments that just barely came in. Katie says, I think, oh, I'm so sorry. Brianna says, not sure if this is on topic, but how can we help the kids feel like they have control and choice? Normally, we let the kids choose their activities, but with kids needing to stay in the same group, they don't have as much choice now.
Yeah, so I love that, because choice is so important for these kiddos to have that sphere of control. So the more that you can just build it in, if they have to play that game, I just call it negotiable and non-negotiable choices. So a negotiable choice would be, you know, what activity to play. But a non-negotiable choice would be, no, it has to be this activity. So within that non-negotiable choice, what can they choose? Can they choose what color? Can they choose where to stand? Can they choose their partner? always just be thinking about it from a non-negotiable and a negotiable stance. And so within this, because they don't have choice here, what can I build in? It's kind of like a child who has to take medication. Let them pick what cup they want and let them pick what liquid they drink with it. If it's a coloring assignment, can they use a pencil or a crayon, a marker, things like that.
Thank you.
Any others on there? Was that the only one? Okay, so just real quick, because this is on the PowerPoint and we can share this out with you. Once we're really good at our self-care and we're taking care of our needs and we're there for the kids, this really just makes community care really easy. And it just means taking care of each other. So be watchful of your peers and your coworkers, be a listening ear. Make sure you're making those social connections. And if you notice someone really struggling and you feel like they could use some support, just go ahead and get them that support. And I would just end with this because I feel like she just said this so well. Margaret Mead is an anthropologist, and a student asked her what she felt like the first sign of civilization was. And they thought she might say clay pots or grinding stones. But she said the first sign of civilization in an ancient culture was actually a broken femur or a thigh bone that had been broken and healed. And so she talked about that in the animal kingdom, if you break your leg, you die because you can't run from danger, you can't get to the river for drink or for hunt for food. And so that means that you're just a target for these prowling beasts. And so she says, no animal survives a broken leg long enough for the bone to heal. So she said, a broken femur that has healed is evidence that someone has taken the time to stay with the one who fell, has bound up the wound and carried the person to safety, and has tended this person through recovery. So helping someone else through difficulty is where civilization starts. And I just thought that was so perfect for community care and really what we're doing with our kiddos, because we're helping each other, and it's just being there, it's being empathic, it's being that safe, trusting person, and it's a slow process, but we will get there. If we stay the course, we will get there, but it does take time.
Thank you so much for coming and presenting, Tammy. We really appreciate it. Um, we'll be showing in the next slide the link to the QR code, and also in the chat box will be the survey. So if you wouldn't mind just sending in those, that would be wonderful.
Yeah.
And yes, Tammy.
I think they still take the screen. I'm not sure if I'll stop sharing. There we go. So you can do that.
All right, and hopefully this is the right screen. Is everyone seeing a QR code?
No, Kristen, we just see your desktop.
Try this again. Thank you for your patience with me as well. This is my first time room hosting in this type of scenario. So
You've done a great job. Thank you, Kristen.
there we go. All right. Thank you so much for coming, and we appreciate it. Hope you guys have a wonderful Thursday, and we hope you can join us next month for After School Nuggets.
Thank you. Thanks, Tammy.